They're gonna let him die.
Everyone in this building already knows how to talk to Arthur Whitfield. Nursing is a small world.
I understand, Dr. Stern.
Nobody knows how to talk to a janitor. That's exactly the point.
They're going to let him die. 6 words, whispered so quietly that a passing cart nearly drowned them out. But Arthur Whitfield heard every single one. He was on his knees in hallway C of Sterling Memorial Hospital, a gray mop bucket beside him, wringing filthy water onto cracked tile at 2:47 in the morning. He did not look up. He did not let his hands stop moving. Because the trembling young nurse standing over him, Sarah Chen, badge crooked, eyes red-rimmed from 3 days without real sleep, was not talking to a janitor. She was talking to the only person left in this building who could stop a murder. She knelt beside him, pretending to help him steady the bucket, and slid a red-tabbed folder beneath a stack of rags. Room 412, she breathed. Marcus Webb, heart failure. Dr. Sterling is refusing him the transplant slot, the real slot, the one he qualifies for because he's on Medicaid. Sterling's giving it to a donor's nephew instead. Cosmetic case. The kid doesn't even need it yet. Arthur's jaw tightened. He kept mopping. I could lose everything for showing you this, Sarah whispered. Then, quieter, almost to herself, I need this to work. Something in the way she said it caught him. Not I need him to live. I need this to work. A small thing. He filed it away without knowing why. Then she stood, smoothed her scrubs, and walked away like nothing had happened at all. Arthur Whitfield, 54 years old, net worth north of $11 billion, owner of the largest private medical group in the country, stayed on his knees a moment longer than he needed to. Not because the floor required it, because for the first time in 6 weeks of pretending to be invisible, he understood exactly why he'd come here. He did not yet understand that he had only found the first layer. The scar was small, barely 2 inches, just beneath his collarbone, silver white and faded with age. Most people who shook Arthur Whitfield's hand across a boardroom table never saw it. His tailors made sure of that. He was looking at it now alone in the marble bathroom of his penthouse, shirt open, tie discarded on the counter. He was 19 the night he got it. A burst appendix that turned septic, a waiting room in a county hospital, and an insurance clerk who told his mother calmly, almost kindly, that without a deposit, he'd have to wait for the next available bed. There were people ahead of him, people who could pay. He nearly didn't make it, 3 surgeries. A permanent reminder etched into his skin of what it felt like to be a name on a list, instead of a patient in a bed. He built Sterling Memorial's parent company, Whitfield Health Group, on a single promise, spoken to a hospital board 11 years ago. No one dies waiting because of what's in their wallet. For a decade, he believed it was working. Then the letters started arriving, not through official channels. Those were filtered, sanitized, massaged by people paid to keep bad news off his desk. These came anonymously. A nurse's resignation letter, forwarded by a friend, describing patients triaged by insurance tier. A malpractice settlement, quietly buried. Involving unnecessary cardiac procedures performed on wealthy patients whose policies paid triple for complexity. A pattern, if you looked hard enough. And Arthur had spent 30 years learning how to look hard enough. There was one more detail he hadn't told anyone, not even his security chief. One of the anonymous letters had been typed on hospital letterhead, the kind kept in a locked cabinet in the executive offices, not the nurse's station. Someone with access to that cabinet wanted him to look, someone close to the top. He picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. I want a service uniform. Night janitorial staff, Sterling Memorial, 3rd shift. I want a name that isn't mine and a background nobody will question. And I want it by Friday. Sir, if I may ask why? Arthur looked at the scar one more time before buttoning his shirt. Because everyone in that building already knows how to talk to Arthur Whitfield. Nobody knows how to talk to a janitor. That's exactly the point. By Friday, Arthur Whitfield had ceased to exist, at least within the walls of Sterling Memorial. In his place, Art Kowalski. 61 years old on paper, a widower, 3rd shift custodial staff, hired through a placement agency that owed Arthur's security chief a favor nobody would ever trace back. Faded gray uniform. A limp he practiced in the mirror until it looked natural. Reading glasses with no prescription, because men don't look twice at a stooped old janitor squinting at floor signage. Hidden in the false bottom of his cleaning cart, a phone, recording continuously, disguised inside a battered radio that hadn't played music in a decade. He wheeled that cart through the corridors of his own empire for the first time on a Monday night, and no one so much as glanced at him. That was the moment it became real, not the uniform. Not the fake name, the asterisk invisibility. Doctors stepped over his mop water without apology. Administrators discussed patient billing in front of him as if he were a potted plant. On his second night, he watched a hospital vice president loudly complain, in the middle of the ICU hallway. That self-pay patients are dragging our margins into the floor, while a janitor named Art stood 8 feet away, wringing out a rag, hearing every word. He learned more about his own hospital in 4 nights than he had in 4 years of board meetings, and he learned the name that mattered most on night 3, Dr. Michael Sterling. Doctor. Sterling was, by every visible metric, a triumph, chief of cardiothoracic surgery, board awards on his office wall. A donor gala every autumn where he stood in a tuxedo beside hospital trustees, champagne in hand, praised as the reason Sterling Memorial's cardiac program ranked in the top 5 in the state. To the board, to the press, to Arthur's own executive team, Michael Sterling was untouchable, successful, beloved. To the nurses who worked his floor at 3 a.m., he was something else entirely. Arthur watched it unfold in fragments, the way invisible men watch everything, from doorways, from behind carts, from the far end of hallways where nobody thinks to lower their voice. He watched Sterling snap at a resident for questioning a surgical order. He watched him corner a nurse near the supply closet and remind her, voice silk smooth and quietly vicious, that people who make waves don't make it in this field very long. He watched him walk past a shivering, uninsured patient in the ER waiting area without breaking stride, murmuring to a colleague that the man was not exactly a priority case. But it was the 4th night that showed Arthur something he hadn't expected. He was mopping outside billing records, half hidden by a supply cart, when he overheard Sterling on a call, door not quite closed. "Schedule the Whitmore boy for the valve repair Thursday," Sterling said. "I don't care that cardiology cleared him without surgery. His father's on the donor committee. We need this or utilized, and Medicare doesn't pay what a private policy does. Bump the web case down the list. He'll survive a few more weeks on the wait list." Probably, Arthur's hands stopped moving on the mop handle. Then Sterling said something that didn't fit. "No, not my call alone, you know that. I run it past her first, same as always. She signs off, I schedule it. That's how this has worked for 3 years, and nobody's asked a single question." A pause. "Because she's the one who taught me how to read a donor committee list in the first place." Sterling was not the top of this. He was reporting to someone. Arthur wheeled his cart around the corner out of sight, and allowed himself 30 seconds, no more, of something dangerously close to rage, tangled now with a colder, more careful thought. Who is she, and how close is she to me? Then he kept mopping. Because Art Kowalski did not get angry, and did not get answers by rushing. Invisible men, Arthur was learning, had to be patient about what they saw, and even more patient about what they didn't yet understand. Sarah Chen had been a nurse at Sterling Memorial for 2 years. Long enough to know which doctors to avoid in an empty hallway. Long enough to still owe over $140,000 in nursing school loans, a fact doctor. Sterling had somehow discovered and mentioned to her once, casually, the way a man mentions a leash he's holding. "Careful who you talk to about scheduling decisions, Nurse Chen," he'd told her 3 months earlier after she'd questioned, gently. Professionally, why a low-acuity patient had jumped the surgical queue. It would be a shame if certain reference calls didn't go as smoothly as they should. Nursing is a small world. She'd said nothing further. She'd gone home that night and sat in her car in the parking garage, engine off, hands steady on the wheel, steadier than they should have been. If this were truly the first time someone had threatened her. Because it wasn't. 6 months earlier, before Marcus Webb had ever been admitted, a hospital compliance officer named Renata Vale had pulled Sarah aside in the break room and asked her, very quietly, whether she'd be willing to keep her eyes open on Dr. Sterling's scheduling patterns. Vale hadn't said why. She'd only said that some inconsistencies had crossed her desk, and that Sarah, sharp, careful, well-liked by the other nurses, was in a good position to notice things without drawing attention. Sarah had said yes, partly because Vale outranked her and it felt safer to agree, partly because she genuinely believed something was wrong. And partly, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, least of all herself, because Vale had mentioned, almost in passing, that compliance officers sometimes recommended promotions for staff who demonstrated integrity under pressure. She told herself it didn't matter why she'd said yes. What mattered was that Marcus Webb was dying, and she had a way to stop it. When Sarah pulled his chart and saw the transplant coordinator's note, candidate reprioritized per doctor. Sterling, pending review, she understood immediately what pending review meant. She'd seen it before. It meant someone else's name had been written in Marcus Webb's place. She thought about her loans. She thought about Sterling's threat, still sitting in her chest like a stone. She thought about Renata Vale waiting somewhere upstairs for exactly this kind of evidence. Then she thought about the drawing taped to the wall in room 412, and the little girl who had made it, and for one unguarded moment, the two motives, the real one and the useful one, sat side by side in her chest without contradiction. She'd noticed the old janitor before, quiet, careful, the kind of man who always seemed to be nearby without ever being seen. Something about him felt different from the rest of the building's furniture. Steady eyes, a watchfulness that didn't belong to an ordinary man mopping floors at 3 a.m. She didn't know why she trusted him over taking the folder straight to Vale, as she'd been asked to. She only knew that, in that hallway, some instinct told her the janitor was safer than the compliance officer, though she couldn't have said why, and didn't examine it too closely. So on that Tuesday night in hallway C, with Marcus Webb's real chart tucked against her ribs under her cardigan, Sarah Chen made her choice. She knelt down beside a mop bucket, and she risked everything she had left, for reasons even she didn't fully understand. Arthur read the chart in the janitor's closet on subfloor 2, door locked, flashlight cupped in his palm so no light would show beneath the door. Marcus Webb was not merely being delayed. He was actively dying while a healthy teenager was prepped for a procedure he did not need, in a hospital that bore Arthur's own name on a brass plaque in the lobby. He photographed every page. He returned the folder exactly where Sarah had hidden it, in the stack of clean linens on her supply cart, precisely as they'd silently agreed without a single further word passing between them. Then he did something Art Kowalski was never supposed to do. He went looking for Dr. Michael Sterling. He found him near the surgical wing at 4 a.m., reviewing charts at the nurse's station, radiating the easy confidence of a man who had never once been questioned by anyone who mattered. Arthur wheeled his cart close enough to overhear, mop in hand, eyes down. "Finish up here, Kowalski," Sterling said without looking up, waving a dismissive hand. "And for God's sake, use the service elevator. I don't want housekeeping smell drifting into the surgical corridor before rounds." Housekeeping smell, Arthur Whitfield, a man who had testified before Congress, who had dined with 3 sitting presidents, who had built a health system meant to save lives like Marcus Webb's, nodded silently and wheeled his cart toward the service elevator. Exactly as instructed. But as the elevator doors closed, reflected faintly in the scratched steel panel, Arthur allowed himself one flicker of an expression Art Kowalski was never supposed to have. Not fear. Not humiliation. Recognition of Sterling, yes, but also of the word that kept surfacing in his mind. She, someone above Sterling, inside his own organization, had been running this for 3 years, and Arthur had no idea yet whether he'd find them on the 4th floor, or whether they'd been sitting across from him in board meetings the entire time. The mop bucket toppled sideways, filthy water spreading across the tile like ink through paper, and Sarah Chen felt Dr. Sterling's fingers close around her wrist before she even registered he was standing there. "What," Sterling said quietly, "do you think you're doing?" It was not a question. It was a verdict already reached. He had come around the corner of hallway C at the exact moment Sarah pressed a second folder, copies this time, one she'd made herself in the records room after hours. Terrified the entire time, into the janitor's cart. Arthur froze mid-motion, mop still in hand, heart hammering beneath a uniform that suddenly felt like paper armor. "Dr. Sterling, I was just—" "Save it." His grip tightened. "I've been watching you for a week, Nurse Chen, asking questions about the web case, pulling charts you have no business pulling. And now this." He yanked the folder free from the cart and flipped it open, scanning the pages fast enough to confirm his worst suspicion. His face went cold, and then, unexpectedly, something closer to fear crossed it. "Does Vale know you're doing this?" he asked, and the question landed strangely in the hallway, too specific, too pointed for Sarah to hide her reaction fast enough. Arthur head bowed, hands trembling with entirely genuine effort, filed the name away. Vale, Sterling wasn't just angry. He was afraid of someone above him finding out, and that someone had a name now. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, too quickly. "Of course you don't." Sterling's laugh had no warmth in it at all. "You copied a patient's protected medical record. That's a federal violation. That's the end of your license." He shredded the folder in his hands, right there in the hallway, tearing the pages down the middle and letting them fall into the spreading mop water at their feet, the same water that had, moments earlier, hidden the original chart Arthur had already photographed and locked away. Sterling didn't know that yet, and Arthur intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. "You're finished," Sterling told Sarah, releasing her wrist with something close to contempt. "I'll have HR draft your termination paperwork by morning." He turned toward Arthur, jaw tight with irritation at having to acknowledge the janitor's presence at all. "And you. Get this trash cleaned up and get out of my hallway." He walked away, footsteps sharp and unhurried against the tile, but not toward the elevator bank that led to his own office. Toward the stairwell that led up, toward the executive floor. Arthur watched him go and understood with total clarity that Sterling wasn't going to hide. He was going to report in. Sarah stood frozen in the wreckage of shredded paper and dirty water, tears finally breaking free. "Sarah," Arthur said quietly. "Who is Vale?" Sarah's head snapped up. "How do you—" He said the name like it mattered more than yours or mine put together. "Tell me." And so, in a hallway smelling of bleach and fear, Sarah told him about Renata Vale, the compliance officer who'd recruited her 6 months ago to watch Sterling. Arthur listened without moving and felt the shape of the thing shift under him for the second time in a week. "Go home," Arthur said finally. "Don't quit. Don't sign anything HR puts in front of you. And don't tell Vale anything else until I say so." "Can you do that?" She searched his face, and something about the certainty in his eyes made her nod slowly. Even though every rational part of her screamed that trusting a stranger over a hospital's chief surgeon, and now, apparently, over the compliance officer who'd recruited her, was exactly the kind of decision that got people destroyed. But she was out of other options, so she nodded and she went home. Arthur spent the next 2 days doing something he should have done 6 weeks earlier. He pulled Renata Vale's personnel file, quietly. Through a request routed so carefully, even his own general counsel didn't know whose file it was. Vale had joined Whitfield Health Group's compliance office 4 years ago. Her prior employer, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring struggling hospital systems and optimizing their surgical throughput before selling them at a markup. Her compensation at Sterling Memorial was unremarkable. Her financial disclosures were clean. But her sister, according to a single line buried in an old conflict of interest form, nobody had cross-checked in 3 years. Sat on the board of a private surgical staffing agency, the same agency that had, for the past 3 years, supplied nearly every high-margin cardiac case Sterling had scheduled outside normal channels. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread, and Arthur had learned that threads, pulled carefully enough, eventually unraveled entire coats. He also learned from his security chief grim news about timing. "Sir, there's a board meeting Thursday morning, full quarterly review. Sterling is scheduled to present the cardiac program's outcomes personally. He's up for the Regional Excellence nomination. Every trustee will be in that room." A pause. "Including Renata Vale. She sits on the compliance subcommittee. She'll be at the table." Arthur looked at the folder in his hands. Thursday. 2 days from now. The room where Sterling would present his numbers, and the room where whoever had built this alongside him would be sitting, watching, believing herself safe. "That's exactly where I want to be," Arthur said. "But Sterling can't know I'm coming for more than him. If he panics and warns her, she'll bury everything before Thursday even starts." Sarah spent those 2 days in a special kind of purgatory. No termination paperwork had arrived, which was strange enough to be almost worse than if it had. She hadn't gone back to the hospital. She hadn't called Vale, though Vale had texted her twice, the second message sharper than the first. "We need to talk about what you gave Sterling's janitor." "Call me?" Sarah stared at that message for a long time, understanding for the first time that Vale already knew far more about the janitor than a compliance officer should. On the second night, her phone buzzed with a different, unfamiliar number. "This is Art. Do not respond to Vale. I need you at Sterling Memorial Thursday morning, 9 a.m., board conference room on the 4th floor. Wear your uniform. Say nothing to anyone about why you're there. Trust me one more time." She stared at the message for a long time. Every instinct told her this was insane. But she thought again about Marcus Webb's daughter, still drawing quietly in that hospital room, still hoping. She thought about how Vale's concern had never once, in 6 months, been about a patient's name. She typed back 3 words, "I'll be there." Thursday morning arrived with the particular sterile brightness of a hospital determined to look its best for donors and trustees. The 4th floor boardroom had been polished, chairs aligned, a projector cued to Dr. Sterling's quarterly outcomes presentation. 12 board members took their seats around the mahogany table. Renata Vale sat near the end, a compliance binder open in front of her, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed composure. Hospital administrators lined the back wall. Michael Sterling stood at the front in a tailored charcoal suit, radiating confidence, though Arthur, watching from the doorway with his cart, noted the faint sheen of sweat at his collar that hadn't been there 2 days ago. At 9:02 a.m., the boardroom door opened, and a janitor walked in pushing a cleaning cart. A ripple of quiet confusion moved through the room. An administrator half rose from her seat, already forming the words to redirect the obvious mistake, but stopped when she saw the second figure follow him through the door. Sarah Chen, in full uniform, chin lifted despite the fear plainly written across her face, stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Michael Sterling's expression flickered from confusion to fury in half a second, and then, when his eyes landed on Sarah and cut sideways toward Vale, something closer to panic. "I told you two to stay off this floor," he said, voice tight, glancing toward the board with an apologetic half-smile already forming. "I apologize, everyone. This is a scheduling error. I'll have security escort." "Actually," Arthur said, and the stoop was gone from his shoulders now, "I think everyone in this room should hear what I have to say first." Something in his voice made the room go still. Michael Sterling stared at him, a flicker of unease crossing his face, as though some deep instinct had just recognized the shape of the ground shifting beneath him. "Who," Sterling said slowly, "do you think you are?" Arthur Whitfield reached up, unclipped the laminated badge that read Art KOWALSKI from his faded gray uniform, and set it gently on the polished mahogany table in front of the entire board. "My name," he said, "is Arthur Whitfield. I own this hospital. And I've spent the last 6 weeks mopping its floors to find out exactly what's been happening in it, and exactly who's been protecting it." At the word *protecting, Renata Vale's pen stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody in the boardroom moved. 12 trustees sat frozen around the mahogany table, staring at the stooped, gray-uniformed janitor who had just introduced himself as the billionaire owner of the entire hospital system. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the projector, still displaying Sterling's cardiac outcomes slide. Michael Sterling let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind a man produces when his brain hasn't caught up with what his eyes are telling him. "That's," he started, then stopped. "That's absurd. Arthur Whitfield he wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Arthur said calmly. "Wouldn't lower himself to see how his own hospital actually treats people when no one important is watching." "You're right, Dr. Sterling. Most owners wouldn't." "I did." He nodded once toward Sarah, then reached into his cart and withdrew the false-bottomed radio. Setting it on the table with the deliberate calm of a man, who had waited 6 weeks for this exact motion. 6 nights ago, Arthur said, I recorded a phone call in the surgical wing. I'd like the board to hear it. This is outrageous, Sterling snapped, turning toward the trustees. Play it, said board chair Millionaire Vance, voice cutting through the room like a blade. Mr. Whitfield, play the recording. Arthur pressed a button. Sterling's own voice filled the room. Schedule the Whitmore boy for the valve repair Thursday. Bump the web case down the list. He'll survive a few more weeks on the wait list. Probably, and then, seconds later, the part Arthur had said nothing about until now. No, not my call alone, you know that. I run it past her first, same as always. She signs off, I schedule it. That's how this has worked for 3 years, and nobody's asked a single question. Because she's the one who taught me how to read a donor committee list in the first place. The word she landed in the room like a second stone, dropped precisely where Arthur had aimed it. Every head at the table turned, almost involuntarily, toward Renata Vale. That doesn't refer to anyone in this room, Vale said, too fast, her composed expression cracking at the edges for the first time. That's a scheduling assistant, that's doctor. Sterling, tell them that's nothing. I pulled your sister's board seat at Meridian Surgical Staffing this morning, Ms. Vale, Arthur said quietly. The same agency that's billed this hospital for 11 high-margin cardiac cases over 3 years. Every one of them scheduled outside normal channels. Every one of them signed off by compliance before it ever reached the board. Your signature, not doctor. Sterling's head turned toward Vale slowly, and something in his face, the fury draining out of it, replaced by a dawning. Furious clarity told Arthur that whatever loyalty had existed between them was already dead. You told me this was protected, Sterling said to her, voice low. You told me compliance would never flag it because compliance was you. Michael, don't. You threatened Sarah Chen's license for me, Sterling said, standing now. And you're going to sit there and let me take this alone. Millionaire Vance rose from her seat, face pale but controlled. Ms. Vale, Dr. Sterling, you are both suspended effective immediately, pending a full independent investigation. Security will escort you from this building, separately. What followed over the next 11 days was not the clean sweep Arthur had imagined 6 weeks earlier, mopping floors in the dark. Sterling, facing charges of insurance fraud and falsification of medical records, cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and in doing so, confirmed that Vale had orchestrated the scheme from the compliance office itself, using her position to bury every red flag before it reached the board. In partnership with the staffing agency, her sister quietly controlled. Vale's arrest followed 2 weeks later, on charges considerably heavier than Sterling's, but the investigation did not stop cleanly at the two of them. Cross-referencing 3 years of Vale's compliance sign-offs, Arthur's legal team found something he had not wanted to find. 2 of the flagged transactions had also crossed the desk of Adrian Cole, Arthur's own chief financial officer of 9 years, a man Arthur had trusted enough to leave entirely off his suspect list. Cole had not built the scheme, but he had noticed the irregular staffing invoices 18 months earlier, run the numbers, and said nothing. Because flagging them would have dented a quarter's margins, he'd already promised the board. Arthur sat with that file alone in his penthouse for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He did not have Cole arrested. There was, his lawyers confirmed, no clear evidence of criminal intent. Negligence and complicity in silence, Arthur had learned, occupied a legal gray zone that fraud and threats did not. But he asked for Cole's resignation the following morning, in a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and ended any relationship of trust that had existed between them. It was not the ending Arthur had wanted. He had wanted a villain he could remove and a system he could declare clean. What he got instead was a hospital with rot 2 layers deeper than he'd first understood, and the uncomfortable knowledge that patience and good intentions had not been enough to keep it out of his own company for 3 years. Marcus Webb received his transplant 9 days after the boardroom reveal, moved to the top of a properly independently reviewed waiting list by a transplant committee that no longer answered to either Sterling or Vale. Arthur visited room 412 one final time, no longer in a janitor's uniform. Emma Webb was there again, drawing at her father's bedside, and when she looked up and recognized him, her face broke into open confusion. "You're the janitor," she said. "I was," Arthur said, smiling, though something in the smile carried more weight than it had 6 weeks earlier. "Turns out I was also apparently the owner. I should have introduced myself properly a long time ago. And I should have been looking a lot sooner than I did." Marcus Webb, still weak but color returned to his face, reached out and shook Arthur's hand. "The nurse," Marcus said quietly. "Sarah. She's the reason I'm alive." "I know," Arthur said, "though I've learned it's rarely just one reason with anything. She had her own reasons for helping you, good ones. In the end, whatever else was mixed in with them. That's more true of most people than we like to admit." Sarah Chen was reinstated within 24 hours of Sterling's removal. When Arthur met with her privately afterward, he told her gently what he'd learned about Vale's recruitment, that her first push toward Marcus Webb's chart hadn't come from nowhere, but from a compliance officer running her own agenda. Sarah took the news quietly. "Does that make what I did less real?" she asked. "No," Arthur said. "It makes it more complicated, which I'm learning most real things are. You could have taken that folder straight to Vale the way you were asked to. You didn't. You brought it to a stranger mopping a floor at 3 in the morning, because some part of you didn't trust the reasons you'd been given. That instinct is worth more than a clean motive would have been." 3 weeks later, Arthur Whitfield stood at a podium in the hospital's main lobby and announced the launch of the Whitfield Dignity Fund and the appointment of Sarah Chen as the hospital's new director of patient advocacy, a position built, this time, with reporting lines that ran through 3 independent people instead of 1, so that no single office could ever again become what Vale's had become. 2 months ago, Arthur told the room, a nurse in this hospital handed a folder to a man she believed was nobody. I used to think that was the whole story, one brave whisper, one grateful billionaire, one villain removed. It wasn't. It was the first thread in a coat I didn't know how deep the rot went, including in places closer to me than I wanted to admit. He paused, looking out at Marcus Webb, seated near the front, Emma's hand resting on his shoulder. "I don't think this hospital is clean now because we found every thread," Arthur said. "I think it's safer because we stopped assuming any one office, including mine, was above being checked. That's the only kind of hospital worth owning. Not one without rot. Every system has rot eventually. One where enough people are watching that it can't stay hidden for 3 years next time." 6 months later, the framed chart still hung in the lobby, beside a small brass plaque bearing a single line, "They're going to let him die." The 6 words that saved a hospital. Beneath it, a second, smaller plaque had been added, Eleanor Vance's idea. Not Arthur's, trust but verify. Every office, every time. Arthur Whitfield still visited Sterling Memorial regularly. Sometimes in a suit, for board meetings that now included a rotating outside auditor with no loyalty to anyone inside the building. But every few weeks, late at night,